Welcome. We're putting on our sociologist hats to open up a sort of legal docket. We're going to cross-examine how state systems have historically and continuously attempted to control women. The goal here is to look past the surface-level narratives of well-known historical events and modern legislation to uncover the hidden, underlying mechanisms of power. Okay, let's dive right in with a question that might sound a little strange at first. What could early modern European witch hunts possibly have in common with anti-Sati legislation in modern India? You'd think these eras and regions are completely unrelated, right? Well, when we actually analyze them sociologically, their legal structures mirror each other almost perfectly. Both systems reveal a really fascinating and honestly deeply troubling pattern of state control over women. To understand exactly why these systems mirror each other, we need to define a core sociological concept: primitive accumulation. Basically, this is a process where the state deprives individuals of their economic autonomy to create a captive, dependent workforce. It effectively strips away all the state's lofty rhetoric about protection or piety and reveals what's really going on beneath the surface: systemic economic marginalization. Keep this concept in the back of your mind as we go, because it's literally the key to unlocking this whole explainer.
So here is our docket for today's briefing. We'll start with the state's legal docket, move into defining acceptable female morality, then regulating the female body, marginalizing women's labor, the anatomy of victim blaming, and finally, our verdict on state power.
Section 1. The state's legal docket. Deconstructing the illusion of protection. We usually assume that laws exist purely to protect the vulnerable. Makes sense, right? But sociological analysis reveals a totally different story. Laws frequently serve to strip women of their agency and actually criminalize their independence. Both historical witch hunts and modern anti-Sati laws act as mechanisms of state control. During the witch trials, the persecution was disguised as a divine duty to eradicate the devil. With Sati, colonial and modern laws were framed as protecting women. But in both scenarios, the law ultimately just reinforced patriarchal and state authority over women's lives. Moving to Section 2, defining acceptable female morality, state propaganda in text. This comparison is wild. Think about the Malleus Maleficarum from 1486. That's the infamous Catholic Inquisitor's manual for hunting witches. It claims women are prone to demonic possessions simply because they have loose tongues and lack physical strength. Now, fast forward centuries later to the Bengal Sati regulation from 1829. It uses the exact same rhetoric of inherent female weakness. It frames widows as helpless victims who absolutely require state paternalism to stop what it calls unlawful and wicked acts. Two texts, separated by centuries and continents, using identical propaganda. They define women as inherently weak or flawed to justify extreme legal intervention. Section 3. Regulating the female body, the symbolic battleground. Whether a system is demonizing a so-called witch or outlawing the glorification of a Sati goddess, both use women's bodies as the symbolic battleground for enforcing social morality. Witch hunts literally criminalized a woman's existence, especially if she was independent, punishing her body through public torture. Sati laws, like the modern 1987 Act, criminalize the glorification of widow burning, which ostensibly is to protect her. But here's the catch: the law still defines her entirely by her relationship to her deceased husband. In both eras, the state is making sure it has ultimate jurisdiction over what a woman's body represents to society. That takes us to Section 4, marginalizing women's labor, uncovering the economic motives. Sociologist Silvia Federici hit the nail on the head here. She argues that the state systematically transformed independent women into reproductive assets. As Europe transitioned away from a feudal subsistence economy into a capitalist monetary economy, the state desperately needed to control population growth and labor. Women who were independent healers, midwives, or farmers, they were a direct threat to this new system. So the witch hunts violently forced women out of the productive economic sphere and shoved them into the reproductive sphere to serve a rising capitalist economy. Let's put this into perspective and track this socio-economic shift across time. Back in the 14th century, the Black Death caused massive labor shortages, which led to the decline of feudalism. By the 16th century, the rise of capitalism required a huge captive workforce, which triggered the European witch hunts and the enclosure of common lands. Now, jump to the 21st century. Capitalist land grabbing and resource competition in rural India are triggering modern witch accusations today. The underlying economic mechanism, dispossessing women of their land and autonomy, is completely identical. And when we look closely at those modern triggers in India, the economic motives become glaringly obvious. Let's say there's crop failure or an illness. The underlying motive for an accusation is systemic scapegoating. It's an easy way to avoid accountability for poor healthcare or failing infrastructure. When the trigger is a dispute over land, the real motive is to dispossess vulnerable widows of their property rights. And if a woman achieves financial independence, she gets accused of witchcraft simply to eliminate competition in a patriarchal system. The data is clear. These accusations are deeply tied to property grabbing and economic control, not just ancient superstitions.
Section 5. The anatomy of victim blaming, evidentiary patterns across eras.
The profile of who gets accused is shockingly identical across the centuries. The target is frequently a widow. She lacks male guardianship. She asserts some form of economic independence. She's often deemed argumentative or having a loose tongue, defying social norms, and she almost always belongs to a marginalized caste or class. This highly specific pattern ensures that women who dare to exist outside the strict boundaries of male authority are the very first ones targeted by these systems of control.
Let's compare two actual cases to see how this cycle of systemic vulnerability repeats itself. Ava Smolland in 1685 England was a poor, middle-aged widow who was accused simply because she lacked male protection and was burdened by loss. Now compare that to the documented modern case of Shri Moody, a tribal widow in India. When a neighbor fell ill, she was immediately blamed, labeled a witch, and a local healer, an Oja, actually suggested pouring boiling oil on her. Despite centuries of so-called legal advancement between these two women, the exact same profile of vulnerability was exploited.
Which brings us to Section 6, Verdict on State Power, the final argument. We've seen how historical and modern legal frameworks mirror each other, but here is the critical takeaway. Modern laws, like the 1987 Sati Prevention Act in India, might look like a huge win on paper, but they frequently fail the very women they claim to protect. Why is that? Because they target the symptom, the physical violence or the glorification of the act, without actually dismantling the disease, which is deep socioeconomic inequality. By failing to address a widow's lack of property rights, inheritance, and social standing, the law leaves the underlying patriarchal disparities completely unchecked. I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up today's explainer. If we can see, through a sociological lens, that legal systems, from 15th century inquisitions all the way to 21st century prevention acts, continually strip women of their economic autonomy and bodily agency, who is the law actually designed to protect? Does it really protect the vulnerable, or does it protect the power of the state and the patriarchal status quo? Take a close look at the laws in your own society and ask yourself who they truly serve. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.